Resume recording. Give just another minute in case we have any stragglers. Okay, well, I have 12 here on my computer, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to day 9 of our summer training series on brain-based advocacy and your work with teens. Today, we are going to continue talking about the promoting of brain gains through a concept called positive youth development. So we're going to talk about positive youth development, what it is, what it means for you, how you can be a functional helper when you're working with a teen. And then we're going to talk about network building for our young people. So we'll introduce a concept called social capital, which is probably a term you're familiar with in other contexts, but maybe haven't thought about too much in your work with youth. So we're going to jump right in. We won't use breakout rooms today, but we will have lots of group discussion where I'll be asking you to unmute, share your ideas, and then also using the chat box. So we'll have lots of good things to talk about this week or this day. I'm not going to keep you all week. So if you just had to take a stab at positive youth development, what do you think it means? Anyone have any thoughts or ideas when you see that term, positive youth development? What does it put you in mind of?
The first thing that pops in, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. The first thing that pops into my head is like a youth who's capable of practicing self-reflection and learning from mistakes and growing in that way.
Yep, I think that's great. Yep, that's a good piece of it. Who wants to build on what Kara said? So kind of having that self-reflection and that, remember that metacognition where you kind of, we think about how we think kind of thing. Great.
Well, helping them understand how to look at things that are positive in their lives versus how many negative things they have interacting with them on a daily basis.
Yep, I think that's good. Yep, looking for those strengths, great.
I would also add maybe whole person development, social, emotional, academic, et cetera.
Yep, great.
Growing all kinds or from all angles.
Yeah, perfect. And I want to add too, Frankie added in the chat kind of healthy social, emotional, and physical development. Perfect. So I'm going to take, you all have great description going on positive youth development, and I'm going to take it one step further and add the word intentional. So, right, we can just as bystanders, right, can have, if we were just kind of on a what do you call those things in the elevator, like, or in the airport, the people movers, not, like the little escalator things, right? You could be on that and have positive experiences. You could have achieved positive youth, development, like brain development. And so the word I want to add to the description to build on what all of you shared is the word intentional, and that we can be really intentional and assertive in promoting positive youth development. So I'm going to share with you, and if you remember from a couple weeks ago, you have a handout called definitions. Positive youth development is on there. And so here from the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, this is one of those Casey family programs. This is the definition they came up with for positive youth development. As you can tell, it's a little lengthy because it has some ideas. But just like all of you said, right, it includes kind of that whole child, looking for those opportunities to build resilience, all of those things that you mentioned, with the addition of being really intentional, really pro-social, and really working to engage young people within their environment. So whether that's their community, their school, their organization, their families, their friends, peer groups, but really looking at that as a brain building and a brain gain opportunity, so that we're being really productive, really intentional and constructive by building those relationships, so that we're kind of taking advantage of that neural development that's happening, right? You can use it and you can improve it when you use that part of your brain, these parts of your brains over and over and over. And they set our young people up for future critical thinking skills, for future relationship building, right? As they kind of grow into adults. So, and I'll make sure I post this full definition in the Google Classroom, just so you have access to it. So nobody feel like you have to furiously write this down, or I'll make sure I post the definition in there for you. So if we were going to sum it up, if I were going to be really simple with it, I would say that positive youth development, sorry, I can only see half my screen. Let me like kind of make this a little smaller there. Okay, there we go. So positive youth development is the sum of our positive experiences. It involves positive relationships and positive environments. Now, that doesn't mean that all of those necessarily are firing on all cylinders, but these are the kind of zones or areas that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about positive youth development and how we can be very intentional with that in our work. And your brains are probably already turning on some of the concepts we've covered so far, and how this folds in really nicely. I also like the term positive youth development because it's a friendly term to use in like team meetings and things like that. I was just in court yesterday and I used the term metacognition, and I'm fairly certain that everyone's eyes glazed over. Because the decision makers with the young person that I was working with yesterday, the decision makers on that young person's team aren't familiar with that term. But positive youth development is a much more approachable concept, I think, and one that we can build action around, and kind of get down to the so what are we going to do about it steps, which I think is what the priority becomes when we're looking at court involved children. So let's think here. When we're going to be engaging in positive youth development, remember SOS, services, opportunities, and supports. That's how we can take advantage and build that positive youth development. So we have kind of three parts of input, or three types of inputs. So let's imagine if you're thinking of all of the outcomes of positive youth development, right? That's the easy part, to think about all the good things that could come from us focusing on positive youth and development, being very intentional about it and very pro-social. But what kind of input do we need to put in to actually get there, right? We can talk about it. We can talk about it very conceptually and very abstractly, but what are the inputs that we need? And many times these fall in those three categories. So SOS, services, opportunities, and supports. And you're probably already thinking back to some of those brain building skills that we were talking about there last week and the week before, where we went through and kind of thought about through in each of those factors and in each of those zones. So hopefully this will be a good visual if you remember SOS, positive youth development. So we want to, of course, have quality services. So as CASA, right, you're not necessarily providing the service, right? You're not the one providing a counseling service. You're not necessarily providing the independent living support that maybe the children's services caseworker is required to provide. But as CASA, part of your job is to evaluate those services, assess those services, and make recommendations and advocate when necessary if those services aren't meeting that child's particular needs. So quality services, might include, education, any kind of adult prep type activities. It could include trauma-informed services. It can include extracurricular type services, like maybe after school activities. But we really want to think about the services, one, in terms of meeting, goals, treatment goals, all of those things that you already know to do. But thinking too of what opportunities do we have here within these services that are already occurring to be intentional when we think about youth development and brain development. So are we creating kind of challenging opportunities for the young person to take on new roles? So I can think of, an example of you're working with a 16-year-old who has moved from foster home to foster home, maybe half a dozen times. They've been in half a dozen different placements. And so as you can imagine, they have maybe fallen a little bit behind in school, but only because they haven't been at school, right? Or because there's all these changes. And so, let's imagine in that scenario that you get involved and see that the child is maybe placed in too low of a grade. There aren't really very high expectations for this student because there's all these assumptions about why they aren't further along in their education. And so creating those opportunities that kind of challenge and raise the expectations appropriately, of course, and within reason. That might be a way that you could take a service that's already happening, right? That educational support is already happening, and then look at it through the lens of positive youth development of, hey, we're not only keeping kids safe here and helping to achieve permanency and all these things, but we're also in the very important business of building brains right now. So how can we take advantage of every opportunity that we have when we're working with young people to do that? Does that make sense? Any questions? Is everyone tracking with me? So I might have already touched on this a little bit, but when we think about opportunities, these are opportunities. I'm thinking of opportunities that are done by the young person, not for the young person, because it's so easy for us to step in and kind of do everything. So really thinking of opportunities for them to grow. This falls in line with that healthy risk taking, right? Of, maybe it's, advocating for the young person to be able to walk to school by themselves. And, if they're obviously old enough, maybe that's one way that we can provide that kind of growth opportunity. Maybe it's giving them an opportunity to try out a different role somewhere, giving them the opportunity to hold down a job, all of those things, but we need to be mindful that we're not being like patronizing, if that's the right word. But we want to make sure that whatever roles or opportunities we introduce the young person to, that they seem legitimate to them, right? This isn't like when you have, in the kindergarten room where, the student who is moving all around the room, you kind of give them the job of like washing the marker, like some silly job to keep them busy. That's not what we want to do when we're working with teenagers and young adults. We really want it to be a legitimate thing that they're working on, or a legitimate role or opportunity. And we really want these tasks to be taken on and done by the young person, right? Not things that we're doing to them, but things that they can do. And, it kind of helps check off a lot of those boxes in terms of that risk taking, building competence. It's a resilience building block. And then we're also kind of working out those parts of their brains that will only benefit them later as they move into adulthood and need to really rely on those critical thinking skills. So thinking about all of this, and I very intentionally was pretty vague in my description of those opportunities and services, but thinking about what types of opportunities do you provide to youth, or do you know that might be available to youth? Or what are some things that you're maybe thinking of now that we're having this conversation? Does anyone want to share an idea?
One way I think of is getting, if there's an opportunity, sometimes getting kids involved in, well, it's education, but positive things at school, like theater, where they can express themselves in different roles and do role playing. Just one thought.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, in that again, if you think back to last week, that expressive arts and that, kind of expressive. I think that helps in a lot of ways. Same thing with like student government or student council or things like that. I know Tara, one of the teenagers that she's worked with, encouraging them to get involved in like organizations at school because they didn't feel like they should, because they weren't sure how long they were going to be there. So they didn't want to. So kind of encouraging them of, for this time that you're here, you can engage in this and you can do it successfully. And that's a great opportunity. So yeah, perfect. I think theater, any kind of expressive art is fantastic. Anyone else have ideas?
I would say even trying to get them involved in the community to a point, whether it's volunteering, because they probably receive a lot of that at times. Now, I don't know what that would look like. I mean, it would just depend on the community. It could be volunteering at a 5K, handing out water, or it could be at a food, I guess it would just have to be very selective, but
Mm-hmm.
it would be a different opportunity for them.
Yep, I think that's a great idea. It reminds me of last week or the week before, someone gave the idea of encouraging I think it's when we were creating the young person bios, someone encouraging them to be the tutor, right, to another child. So yeah, great. Giving those opportunities to step into leadership roles and problem solve all those stuff. It's right. It's that tough work that we need to do to build those neural pathways.
And I've had several teens that are like juniors, seniors. And so showing them college resource material and teaching them how to use it, and then letting them go through it on their own without feeling pressured, I thought was really helpful.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a great strategy as well. I'm a big believer in having high expectations for any young person that I work with. And I think when you do that, appropriately and efficiently, you kind of tell that what you're really saying to that young person is, hey, I believe in you. And that's pretty powerful thing. Great. Any other thoughts on other opportunities, or how specifically, maybe it's something that you're thinking about and say, oh gosh, this is an opportunity. How can I make sure that we're really thinking about this through the lens of that promoting brain gains? So any other thoughts on how an opportunity might promote brain gains?
What about opportunities for them to job shadow someone, so that, not all children are cut out for college. You want them to go, but just, involving maybe different professors, allowing them to job shadow the students, to job shadow them, or out in the community, they could job shadow different types of work within the community that they might be interested in.
Yeah, that's a great strategy. Yeah, we had a young person a couple of years ago who really when we talked about his career goals, he said, well, I want to own a construction company one day. And so we talked to a local home builder company who's been a longtime supporter of CASA. And so he took this young person along with him kind of for a week, took them out on jobs and, showed him how to draft, I don't know what you call it, estimates or whatever, so, kind of cool things. Just thinking about who are the people we know in the community that could, lend a hand here and help here. And it's such a good challenge. Nancy shares in the chat a good idea, outdoor activities, because my little 5-year-old had never been to a pool. Yeah, great. Yeah, anything like that. I'm always, it's somewhat startling, but also telling when you talk to, young people that we work with, and something, maybe we take for granted, or an experience we take for granted, and they say, oh gosh, I've never done that before. And what a good, healthy risk for them. Kara shares, opportunities promote brain gains because they are able to take healthy risks and learn from new experiences. Absolutely, 100%. Pat shares, encourage them to get involved in sports, both individual like track, but then also maybe team sports. Great. Yeah, Frankie shares like being careful about like kind of destining children to college. So too many kids kind of perform poorly in high school, but then go to college and they're fine. Yeah, no, I knew what you meant. Yeah, I think we seem to be swinging away from that a little bit. I think, I was in high school, like I graduated high school in the early aughts, and there was a really big push, 20, 25 years ago to, it was all about, you got to go to college. Like if you want to be successful, you got to go to college, you got to go to college. And I've noticed in the last 5 to 10 years that there's been a little bit of more of a shift of, college isn't necessarily the answer for everybody. I think when there's lots of people out there with like very expensive college degrees because they were kind of pushed and maybe made those decisions too early. So I think being supportive of that and kind of, encouraging the shadowing and exploration, right? Sometimes the experience is to figure out what you don't want to do, right? You go and shadow something, you figure out, oh, nope, I don't want to do that. So that also works. Tanya shares a good tip. She says it's important to connect with the caregivers to educate them on the importance of experiences that promote brain growth opportunities so that they can also engage the youths when the CASA is not around. Absolutely. And really engaging the whole team. Earlier on, that's when I said, I love the term positive youth development because it's a much more approachable term. For those of you that were a little late getting on yesterday in court, I used the term metacognition, like thinking about how you think, learning how to think. And I got a bunch of blank stares because that's not a term that's familiar with people who work on these teams, right? And so, I think this is very approachable way to build conversations around this. So yeah, great tip, Tanya. Great. And finally, remember we said SOS, services, opportunities, and support. And we're going to really deep dive into support a little bit. But when we think about support, think about it in terms of those relationships that we build that allow the young person to take advantage of all of those services and opportunities. So think of services, opportunities, and supports almost like a three-legged stool. When we have these appropriate supports and these healthy supports, it's what can help set this young person up in order to be able to get the full benefit of whatever the services and whatever opportunities come along, right? Because we could have great opportunities, all the ones you mentioned, for job shadowing, for exploring things, trying new ideas, all of those things that you shared, getting out in the community. But if we don't have those effective supports for it, then that's going to be really challenging for those to be a benefit. Kind of like Tanya said, really pulling in maybe the caregivers and other members of the team to this. So supports can take on a variety of forms. It could be friendships, it could be more formalized relationships. But in order to be an effective part of this triad, right, this kind of SOS model is that it has to be respectful, it has to be affirming, it has to be ongoing. It can't just be something where we say, yep, we did your support, we checked the box, let's move on. And it has to be offered by a variety of people. So we really need, it's great to have that one supportive person. We all know that research. But when we're really talking about the business of brain gains and the business of setting young people up with a healthy foundation to move into adulthood, we want them to be surrounded. Because you probably don't have, you all probably have relationships with lots of people. And if you think of your best friends, the person that you're closest to, whether it's your spouse, your partner, a sibling, a friend, think of that person. That person is not probably the person who provides you with 100% of all of your support needs, right? There are probably other people in your life who are your go-to if you need X, Y, and Z. If you probably have someone in your life who provides you kind of career support, you probably have someone who's emotional support. You probably have that friend that you only see once or twice a year, but when you do, you have so much fun catching up on everything and kind of supporting each other. So it's kind of silly that we would expect a teenager to get all of their support from just one or two people, when we know as adults, right, we are kind of in this fabric of relationships that we create for ourselves, and relationships have different levels of importance to us in terms of our development. So we really want to try and cultivate these supports from a variety of places. So imagine, when we did the circle activity where you kind of identified supports, imagine if you were standing in the center and that was kind of like a web, and you were thinking about your web of support or your, kind of network of support. check the chat box here. Oh, Pat asked a good question. The handout, the slides aren't posted yet, but I'll make sure, because it's just one huge slide deck. So at the very end, you'll have access to absolutely everything. And I'll leave the Google Classroom open indefinitely, so you can continue to access any of the resources that we cover. So yeah, good question. But yes, and again, supports, these are things we're doing with young people, not to them. Now, there certainly probably are services out there that happen to someone, but when we're talking about this positive youth development, these are really empowering and pulling young people along as partners in this. And maybe even they're leading it and telling us what they need. So another way that we can think of building this network or this web of support is this term that is called social capital. So you probably can think about social capital and maybe have not really thought about it in the context of working with a teenager and in the context of a young person. So we're going to deep dive into social capital here in a minute. But does anyone have any thoughts on how supports promote brain gains? Is anything here striking anyone or anyone having any reactions to it? Okay, well, let's kind of keep on going here before we deep dive into that social capital a little bit more. I want to wrap up our SOS conversation and talk about this concept of being a functional helper. And this term might be new to you, but the concept, I'm sure, is not new to you. So when we can assess that a young person, a teenager, can do something on their own, we want to support them doing it and try to resist that urge that we as grownups have sometimes to just step in and do it all, because it'll get messy if the teen does it, or we're worried that it might be difficult for the teen to cope with. So we just want to step in and take care of everything. So try to resist doing that. So if it's a matter of looking at, someone mentioned looking at colleges or exploring college ideas, really encouraging them to and supporting them, guiding them, but really letting them kind of do that work. That way it's not you kind of saying, here's the list of 5 colleges that I think would be good for you. Choose from this 5, but really going through the exercise of the work with them of, what are your priorities when you're thinking about going to college? What's important to you? What makes you nervous? What worries you? What is your non-negotiable? This has to be there when you think about it. And then ask them, how would you go about finding colleges that meet these needs, and let them take the lead on that. And being, again, being a functional helper is almost like, it's not quite like being a mentor, but it kind of leans that area, leans in that direction a little bit, but giving really clear feedback. So you want to kind of note when someone's working really hard on something, note what positive behaviors you're seeing, what strengths you're seeing, but then also offering them ideas of areas where they might have opportunities to try something different. And really, really can't stress this enough. We've talked about this almost every session, really working on engaging that young person as a partner in this and as a member and really as the leader of the team when you're thinking about plans for their lives, for their behaviors, whatever it is. So if let's say you're working with a teenager who's in a residential facility and maybe they are experiencing or displaying some behaviors that have been, pretty disruptive, or maybe it's even, leading to that placement not really being able to meet their needs anymore, let's say, or there's questioning, maybe there's a punitive approach being taken with the young person. So having a constructive conversation with that teenager about it, right? And being really direct about, hey, we've been noticing in the reports that I've been getting that you have been that you were hitting people, like hitting the walls, being destructive, and really breaking it down and pulling them in, asking them to help you understand that behavior And that's where you lean on those, tell me about questions, those really open-ended questions to understand this behavior, and try to, again, applying that trauma-informed lens, and then thinking through what could their action plan be? What could they do differently? What things maybe need to change within their environment in order for them to be successful there? And these are just ideas off the top of my head, but having those types of conversations with young people, rather than going in saying, hey, I heard you tore up a bunch of stuff last week, you're going to get kicked out of here if you keep doing that. But instead having, a really frank conversation about, this is what it takes for you to stay here. Here's what could happen if that's not possible. And, what are we going to do about it together? As a much more productive conversation. I've been working with a sibling group of teenagers where I'm having those kinds of conversations on a very regular basis, especially as we notice that maybe the caregivers and the people who are more involved on a day-to-day basis, right, who are the ones interacting with that young person every single day, every single time there's an incident, they're so fatigued. They have so much caregiver fatigue. And so for me, I come along, just once or twice a week and have conversations with this young person. So the dynamic of my relationship is different, which is one of the reasons CASA exists, right? Is that we need that person who's a little bit more, 1 or 2 steps back and isn't providing direct care every day, in order to keep that bigger perspective. So let's talk about social capital. And again, this is the social capital. We're talking about building this network and building this web. There are really, I think I have somewhere I thought it's somewhere I have a definition here. But social capital is really those social networks and those social relationships. So it can be, social capital can be the bonding between similar people. So peers who have a lot in common, right? And they kind of come together. It's where you see, every teenage movie from the 90s, right? It's kind of like, oh, there's the jocks and there's the math geeks and there's the chess club and there's the, football team, and they're all kind of cohorted together because they have these similarities about them. So there's this natural bonding that can occur in any social situation when you have similar traits. But also social capital and that building of relationships can sometimes be that bridge between diverse people. So, that creating those networks and that capacity for relationship building can help build those bridges between people who maybe have more differences than commonalities. And social capital sometimes is described as kind of the value system, or the value that's created when we put in time and energy into relationships. And when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about genuine relationships. So you can have relationships of, think of it on a continuum. So we're thinking of relationships that are built through trust and through reciprocity. So we're not talking about one-sided relationships, but really these kind of healthy, balanced relationships that we want to build. And so for our young people, these could be with peers, these could be with friend groups, with academic peers, they could be with adults, they could be with people out in the community as well. So there are kind of 3 things I hope that you'll remember about social capital. They're kind of, I think the curriculum calls them dimensions. But one is kind of the quantity of an individual's social relationships. And that doesn't mean, this isn't a judgment. This isn't, you need to have lots and lots of relationships, or you need to have just very few relationships. We're not talking about that. It's just that the quantity of those relationships is one of the dimensions of social capital. And then we have the second very important part, which is the quality of those relationships. So that's where we go back to trust and reciprocity. Are these supportive relationships, balanced relationships, or are they really one-sided? Right? You can all probably think of people in your life where you have kind of maybe a tilted relationship with them, right? Where maybe you're their major support person, but they're not your major support person. So you have this little bit of imbalance. It doesn't mean that that's a bad relationship. It just means that it's one of many types of relationships that you probably have. And then the third dimension of social capital is the resources or the value of the resources that partners in these social relationships can potentially make available to one another. And so we're using economic terms here. We're using words like value and resources. But resources here might not necessarily mean tangible things. It could mean more of, having someone that you trust, having that person that you, right, your career person that you bounce those career ideas off of, having the person that you talk to when you're having an argument with a loved one, right? We all kind of have those people in our lives. And really, social capital at its very basic level is how we interact with each other and how we use those interactions and build on those interactions in order to create the mechanism by which our future relationships will be housed. So when we have, let's say, teenagers who are isolated because of their involvement in the child welfare system. So they're isolated. Maybe they're in a residential facility where it's difficult to have these healthy relationships, or those relationships are constantly being disrupted. As that young person becomes an adult and is out in the world, they might have to be a little more active in their work to build healthy and effective relationships. All of you have probably worked with a parent who had a long history of being in foster care themselves. And so think about that parent in your mind. Please don't share who it is, just think about it. And think about how those early disruptions in relationships and the fact that they didn't really get a chance to build these relationships and build social capital, what impact that has on their relationships today. What impact that has on their ability to even form a healthy relationship or maintain a relationship, what impact that has on their coping skill, all those things. So you can probably think, is everyone kind of thinking, can you think of someone like that where you've seen that play out in the future for them? Oops, getting ahead of myself. So let's, as a group, think about and talk about, why is social capital or building networks of support for young people important? And why and my thoughts are, let me back up a second so I make sure this question makes sense. So in the child welfare system, there's a really big emphasis on permanency, particularly when we're working with older youth who have maybe been in the system for a while. So there's a lot of talk about permanency of, what's the long-term plan here? Where are they going to live? What's their support? Are they safe? All of, all those things that we talk about. And so often we've already talked about legal permanency tends to focus on, where are they going to live? What's the plan when they turn 18? Are they going to end up adopted or with a legal custodian? Are they going to be aging out or emancipating? What's the plan? How are we going to achieve legal permanency for them? And what I think is left out of that conversation often is this building of networks, this building of these informal support networks, and this kind of web of relationships. So my thoughts are, what ideas does everyone have on how we can elevate the importance of social capital to be up there somewhere in the ballpark of the importance of legal permanency? Or should it be? Does it need to be that much of a priority? Why do you think it isn't? Or if so I'm just interested in hearing your reactions to that. And feel free to unmute and just talk freely or add it in the chat.
Well, are you asking, I'm not quite sure. I mean, basically this is networking, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So are you asking why it's important for teenagers to do this? You know what I mean? For teens to do this with one another, or with their parents in the system, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was giving the example of parents. So yes, when we think about teens and young people, sorry, my question wasn't very clear. What can we do, or why is it important or not important, depending on your opinion, to elevate social capital in our teens to the same kind of ballpark of importance as legal permanency?
Got it. Well, if that's the question, I would say it's absolutely important, because every time they make a relationship with someone, they're growing, they're getting something out of it because they're learning to socialize, they're learning to open up, they're learning to, they're learning to communicate. And so I'm sorry. So every time they do that, so the more relationships and the more people they can, build relationships with, the more they're going to grow. And who knows, they might meet somebody who they really can relate to, they can really, look up to, they could really kind of emulate as a role model, whatever. So I think that would be, and that also goes to the positive youth development where they're building experiences, relationships, et cetera. And I think the other side product or byproduct, I guess, is they're in different environment, that person could expose them to a different environment, to a different, career path, who knows what that person could. So I think the more people they can talk to, the better.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was a good thought there. I want to share too the chat, which kind of builds on all of those. Pat shares, social capital is critical to the formation of those future success in kind of working with others, communicating with others, dealing with others. And Deb shares that her cases have mostly been younger kids, not teens, but almost all of the biological parents have had no social capital that helped them. So a lot of that, a lot of those relationships that they had didn't really build value for them, and maybe were negative or detrimental. Yep.
I would say I actually visited one of my families the other day, and it was very interesting because I came with just some books or whatever, and their eyes were huge because, they're in a great spot, don't get me wrong, but they don't encourage reading. Like that wasn't a thing. So when they saw books, they're like, you want us to read? Like they were so shocked by that, so it's just a different perspective coming in, I mean, they just couldn't imagine that someone would actually encourage them to read in the summer. So, but I mean, so that's that whole, just different perspectives, I guess.
Yeah. And having, back to that piece of them those relationships coming from a variety of directions, right? All those supports coming from a variety of people.
Mhm.
Yeah, Kara, I think early on I had shared the story of kind of the young lady who had come to my office years after I had worked with her, needing support. And then I had this moment of, gosh, I don't know that I did a great job as your caseworker if I was the only person you could think to call for help years later. And what really had happened there was that we kind of neglected to create these connections for that young person. Yeah. So it's interesting to me, when we think about the goal of legal permanency. Oh, yeah. So yeah, Tanya is on it. So she says in her experience, there have been instances where children have been able to find legal permanency through someone in their social circle that was added as a result of their case with the agency. So someone that kind of came along as this process was going on ended up also being able to be part of their legal permanency plan. Yeah, absolutely. I say it all the time. My coworkers probably hate hearing me say this all the time, but you don't know what you don't know. And so when we start having these kind of conversations that get messy sometimes when we're talking about relationships and young people and networks and all this, it can get a little bit messy. But we could miss an opportunity if we don't have those conversations and explore those relationships and encourage those relationships. But when we focus so much, right, our court system tends to focus on legal permanency, right? Of, what's the plan here? This child's turning 18. Have we met all of the independent living goals? All the things that are kind of those guideposts that the law sets up for us. And those are the things largely that Children's Services is required to operate within, right? Too, that's how the system is designed. And so when we ignore this issue of social capital, positive youth development, all the stuff we've been talking about, all these great ideas that you've come up with that don't necessarily fall within the, kind of categories of things that are generally discussed in the legal side of things, we could create legal permanency, but we might that might just be a point in time for them. And what we're really in the business of when we're talking about positive youth development, brain-based advocacy, and really working with teens to help them to set them up to be successful adults, is looking beyond 18 in one day and really looking at, how can we give them as many tools and as many supports, as many opportunities so that they can move into that and be successful, rather than just kind of technically having achieved legal permanency, and really looking at, what can we do to set them up for success in their future relationships, in their future problem solving skills, and their future executive functioning, right? All of those things that rely so heavily on that early adolescent brain development. And these are little things, right? Some of these, social capital ideas and, following the SOS model, those aren't things you need to necessarily go to court for and ask for a court order to get those things happening. It's just being the person who has that conversation, starts the conversation, mentions it at the team meeting of, what are we doing to maintain peer relationships for Johnny? What opportunities does Johnny have to interact with peers? Are there opportunities for Lucy to be out in the community, doing something, doing whatever in the community, right? Those are just questions we can ask. We don't, those aren't necessarily huge things that we need to get court orders for necessarily. So there's a lot of work that CASAS can do kind of in between those guideposts that exist that guide our overall framework of our work. Does that make sense? Any other ideas, anything anyone wants to add to that? I know you all have a wealth of experiences as well. So we're gonna kind of wrap up here with a quick 2-minute activity. So if you have a piece of scrap paper or however you wanna think on this, we're gonna take 2 minutes. I'll give you 2 kind of quiet minutes and just silently reflect and write down or think about your responses to the following 3 questions that you see on the screen. One is, how can you work with young people to build their social capital? So 1 or 2 ideas. And then what ideas or actions would you recommend? And how does social capital, whatever idea you have, how does that specifically promote those brain gains? And I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, that's been 2 minutes. I don't know if it feels long to you, but when I'm just sitting here for 2 minutes and trying not to move or be distracting, it feels really long to me.
It doesn't.
It probably doesn't feel long when you're thinking about stuff, but I'm just sitting here trying not to bounce all around like a wild person. So let's hear from some folks on, just kind of, one thing that you've thought of as you reflected on these questions, one idea to just kind of contribute. And these are, hopefully you'll walk away thinking about everyone's ideas, and, you never know when an opportunity might come along in your work where you're like, oh gosh, I could try this out. I heard this in that training. So who wants to go first?
I think I would use the circle about the services, opportunities, and support. And I would encourage them with their critical thinking. Like, if this scenario came up on your circle here, who would you go to talk to? And, what opportunities would you like to see for yourself? And how would you, what person would you go to? And how would you go about looking at the services or things, and how can we support you in that? So encouraging them to be the main person in charge of thinking about what they want and how to get it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I love the 3 circle. I think it's a good visual. And it's, something, especially if you have maybe a young person who's really creative, they might kind of get real creative with it. So yeah, I love that strategy. I do a lot of self-care trainings, like resilience trainings, and I've started using a self-care action plan that's very visual, based on boxes. And there's a piece in there of kind of who's your emotional support, who's your spiritual support, who's your cognitive support, all those kind of practical supports. And those visuals seem to be really relatable to people. Great. Yep, Kara says, kind of has that visual showing of what supports they actually have when they're maybe feeling a little more alone. Yeah, that's a great point. Anyone else have any other strategies or thoughts about how you could build social capital, or what ideas or actions you might recommend?
I just really appreciate the story that you were sharing a few minutes ago about Tara, encouraging the team to pursue student council, because I see that as a major issue in building relationships. Is like just the it's not news to you all, but just the thought that everything's temporary and transient, and so what's the point? And so by encouraging those, I think that can really promote a lot of brain gains, actually.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, Nancy shares too that she would kind of almost curate a list of all the resources that are available. So educating herself about coaches, mentors, clubs, sports teams, activities, all those things, so that you can kind of have those in your mind and be aware of them when you have the chance to talk to a young person about them. Deb shares a great tip of really spending enough time, like adequate time with the teenager, to get to know them well enough to kind of know what might work for them, what you might suggest, what you might encourage. Debbie shares a good idea of getting them involved in an activity that they liked with new people, so they can kind of build new friends, build those new relationships that, you create that positive feedback loop, because we know that teenagers are more wired to learn from their peers, good or bad, than they are from adults. So any opportunities we have to let them flex those brain muscles, if you will, are great. Yep, advocating for opportunities outside of just those school activities to promote relationships. That's a great point too, of really, looking beyond just the confines of school and really looking at the larger community. Fantastic. And one that I want to mention, and we'll actually talk a little bit more about it at a later week, but when I think about these kind of relationship building and thinking of the way that young people communicate and socialize and build relationships with one another, I can't help but think that the elephant in the room is like online social media relationships, because it's so much about so much of how we carry out relationships and share information and get to know one another. And, we don't have time in this group to necessarily talk about all the pros and cons and safety, you know, all those things. There's lots of information and expertise out there. But I think it's something we can't deny is a reality that we have to have in our minds and think about. And how do we support healthy relationships and keep in mind the existence of, we almost have this other plane of interactions with people that we didn't necessarily have 20 years ago. And that's changed relationships a little bit. So I don't know the answer to that, but it kind of sticks out in my mind as we talk about relationship building. I know when I talk with middle schoolers and junior high and high schoolers, they're like, I'm so disconnected from my friends because I'm not on Instagram. Everybody's on Instagram. So everybody know, you know, so I don't know the right or wrong answer, but it's definitely seems to be a factor that impacts young people. And we can tackle that monster at a later week, but it's something that I think about when we are having these conversations. So we have just a few minutes left. Are there any other ideas about social capital building? Did I miss anyone? Well, I just wanted, since we covered a lot today, I wanted to give you just a few key takeaways and tie it back to some of the stuff we've been talking about in the last 8 weeks. Really thinking about all of the SOS, those services, opportunities, and supports being really essential and kind of acting as a counterweight to the effects of trauma. And we can kind of use those tools, use those inputs in positive youth development, right? That's what SOS is. They're inputs to positive youth development, and using those to help promote healthy brain and healthy social development. And really remembering that positive youth development isn't just the things that happen incidentally. This is that assertive and intentional pro-social approach to youth development. And of course, you all know that the need for effective and holistic trauma-informed or trauma-specific, trauma-competent practices, so that we can, support. There's, in addition to the business of just growing teen brains, right? There's also, with the population we serve, these kind of trauma, grief, all of these things to also work through. And a lot of you touched on this. I heard the word resilience being used quite a bit today. So the resiliency and then that neuroplasticity, that kind of neural pruning that happens and the reshaping of those neural pathways really provides the foundation to this. So when we talk about relationship building, when we talk about problem solving, healthy challenges, healthy risks, we're taking advantage of this very malleable brain that an adolescent has so that we can build a good foundation for them for the future. And then, we talk a lot about if you don't use it, you lose it, right? You have that synaptic pruning, right? There's thousands of synapses that get pruned in an adolescent brain every single day. So if you don't use it, you lose it. But also if you use it, you improve it, and you kind of myelinate it. So we can take advantage of that, especially when we're talking about a young developing adolescent brain. And then finally, really think back to that functional helping concept as we're moving forward in the next couple of weeks, really talking about services and practical supports, because we really want to make sure that we're operating in the zone of functional helping and not dysfunctional rescuing. We really want to be a functional helper because that's how we can, flex those muscles, those neurological muscles, if you will, to build healthy foundations moving forward. All right, we have 2 minutes. Any remaining questions, thoughts, ideas? Everyone ready to run for the hills because I mentioned youth and teens using social media and we're all terrified now. All right, well, I will get the recording up later today and I will see you all next Tuesday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.